Every once in a while, there's a new lens that comes out and it's so good that it never comes off of your camera body. The Sigma 28 to 105mm f2.8 may be that lens for you. Is this the lens that you've been waiting for? Or perhaps an awesome lens that you didn't know you needed? Or perhaps it's just all hype? Well, I'll be sharing what this lens has to offer so that I can help you decide whether this is really for you or you should be looking elsewhere. As someone who takes photo and video for my church as well as the occasional portraits, YouTube videos as well, I've been using the Sony A7 IV with the Tamron 28 to 75mm f2.8 version 2. I love that lens for everything. The only downside was the focal range. Without a doubt, 28 to 75mm, although it's a little bit tight on the wide angle side compared to the typical 24 to 70mm, I'd often wish that I had a little bit more zoom on the telephoto end, even beyond the 1.5 times crop with the super 35mm mode that Sony alpha cameras provide, which pretty much is giving you a punched-in version of whatever your lens is. You see, Sony makes a 24 to 105mm, but it's f4. And since I was using that Tamron lens, I didn't want to give up my 2.8 aperture, especially when I'm shooting photos indoors. But then this Sigma 28 to 105mm f2.8 released, and I haven't looked back. So I sold my Tamron lens and the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II to get this. In hand, this is 2.2 pounds or 1 kilogram of weight, which is pretty average for any zoom lens at f2.8. Made of metal. Definitely feels more premium than the Tamron lens that I had, which was more plastic. In the box, you can expect to have a lens hood that I typically don't use. This may be a con for some of you, but this barrel does extend, so keep that in mind. And if you're worried about this barrel extending inside your bag, this next feature is something that you will appreciate, and that is this lock switch. This prevents your lens from zooming in as you're holding it, whether it's in your bag, in your hand, around your neck, whatever it may be. This is not going anywhere. I've owned this for a couple months and this has not yet failed me. Perhaps in a couple years, maybe this lens will be a little bit more loose, but we'll see. As a Sigma lens, this is really just a manual zoom. We're not looking at any power zooms that we would love out of big lenses like this with huge focal range, because I do believe they make a full frame cinema version of the 24 to 105. But again, that is also at f4. We have two circle buttons, top and bottom, which are programmable. Got a traditional AF/MF switch. One thing that would make this lens killer though is a macro mode, but this is not a dedicated macro lens. But the closest that it can focus is about 15.8 inches or about 40 centimeters. If you look closely at the glass though, you will notice that it does have an 82mm filter thread. Well, although this is my favorite lens, I do also have other lenses that I step up to 82mm. So I can go ahead and use my other filters interchangeably without any problem. So this is just one less lens that I have to use a step-up ring for. But don't worry, we're not really buying this lens so we can attach a filter, but in fact, we are honoring this lens because of the zoom range. Now, if it's your first time buying a zoom lens like this with a wide range of focal lengths, here's how you can best maximize this lens. At the widest focal range at 28mm, this is not going to be ultra wide for landscapes, but it's going to be good enough to get your environment. Perhaps you want to get, smaller landscapes. Vlogging is really not going to be your strong suit unless you put this on a tripod and put it far away from you. Some people ride or die by the 24mm, but for me, 28mm is perfectly fine for what I need. Moving up, you'll start to move up to 35 to even 50mm, which is a classical standard focal length for you to shoot everyday things. So you can just switch back and forth whether you are in a smaller space. Stay at 35. If you got a little bit more playroom on the outdoors, perhaps you want 50. And then moving up to 70mm, or maybe you can set somewhere in between to 85mm. This is going to be where your portrait range of focal lengths are going to be. And this allows for more pleasing backgrounds with more bokeh and blur as you bring your subject closer to the lens and being able to have that nice sense of shallow depth of field. For me, I just really use all the way at 105 just to get the most out of my telephoto shots and to get that deeper compression, if that's even such a thing. But anyway, you're isolating your subjects more and you're really just making the most out of this focal range at this point. When I'm in church, although I don't have a 70-200 f2, I will basically live at 105 and then I'll switch back and forth between super 35mm mode, which allows me to punch even more, giving me about 157mm. I use the Sony A7 IV. Perhaps you have the A7R or the regular A7 III. Those lenses will be great. I think the only lens that doesn't really provide this is the Sony A7S III and probably the FX III, which are pretty much the same camera. For photos, yes, I get a little bit less megapixels when I use super 35mm mode, but I hardly ever notice the difference when I'm using it for socials or my phone. Now there's some things we can't ignore about this lens, and just like other mirrorless cameras, this does have a fly-by-wire focus ring. You're not going to have hard stops for your focus ring. You can just keep spinning and spinning. Fortunately, it does allow for smooth focusing, and whether you move it back and forth fast or slow, it's still going to give you a rather consistent focusing experience. In terms of autofocus, you're going to get a rather quiet experience. May not be entirely silent for video, but if you're really just capturing this audio from elsewhere, you won't really notice. If you really want to practice your focus fracking, switching from one subject to another, you will notice some breathing, but this is no biggie for me. Moving back even further to the lens, we do have a dedicated aperture ring, which you can find on most premium lenses, and this too also has a lock switch, so you can go ahead and experience that the way you'd like. Fortunately, there's also a de-click and click feature where you can go ahead and decide if you want a more tactile and audible experience, or you just want it to be much smoother so that you can go ahead and film your video nice and quietly. But the real magic is in the back. As you look closely, you will notice that there is a rubber gasket. This lens is indeed weather sealed, so in some light rain, you're good to go. Now, although I don't plan on taking this camera lens out to the typhoon season of the Philippines, I do trust that my camera will do well in some light rain. Most of the time, I'll be spending my time indoors in my church or in this bedroom studio just capturing and creating. In terms of my real world experience, I do mostly shoot a lot of my content in f2.8, just having my aperture as wide as possible. I mean, it performs well at f2.8. I haven't had any issues. I usually shoot with a shutter speed of 1/250 or 1/25 of a second, and I keep my ISO below 6400. I recently bought the Sony 70-200mm f4 macro, and that is just amazing. But when I tried to use it in my church, I was missing the ability to stop down to f2.8 on this lens and to keep my ISO lower to avoid adding more noises to my images. Noise to my images. If I'm taking my Sony A7 IV in any indoor situation, the Sigma is the way to go. I just feel like you can capture anything with this lens. Tracking is reliable, the image is excellent and sharp, and I don't feel like I need to pay Sony G Master prices to get nearly the same quality. The center sharpness is pretty excellent from 28mm to 105mm. Yeah, the edge sharpness may be a little bit, a little bit less, not as sharp on the wider angles, but as you start to stop down at f4 to f5.6, like with other lenses, you will notice some improvements. But even without pixel peeping, it won't take you long for you to realize that this lens is not stabilized. In fact, you just need to rely on your Sony camera with its in-body image stabilization, or a stabilizer. But most of the time, I'm just comfortable hand holding this close to my body with 1, 2, and my body as a third contact point for most stabilization. I also leave my Sony A7 IV with active stabilization just to really help lock off my tripod-like shot. This lens will also balance well on my RS3 gimbal. I'll usually go ahead and mount it at 50mm and really try to get a better balance that way. But if you're really gonna go ahead and pixel peep, you will still notice things like some minimal chromatic aberration, which is going to be present at the high contrast edges and at the lower apertures of f2.8. You're going to get some barrel distortion at 28 millimeters and some pin cushion situation at 105 millimeters. Vignetting is going to be a thing at f2.8, but of course it's going to be reduced the more that you stop your aperture down. So keep this all in mind when you realize that the cost of this lens is going to be $1,499 US, which is still more affordable than Sony's 24 70mm G Master lens Mark II at $2,298 US. At a similar price point, you can nearly get 2 Tamron lenses for the price of one of these. One of those lenses would be the 17 to 28mm f2.8 lens, which is going to be good for your wide to medium shots, as well as pairing up the 28 to 75mm f2.8 lens, which is what I was using before, and those will be great for the same price that this is, especially if you can buy it used. If you still want the zoom range of 24 to 105, Sony sells that for $1,098 US, but again, it's a constant f4. Maybe you'd find it worth it if you can get some good used prices for it. I think I was able to get it for maybe like $800, which is still pretty good. If you want something with more range than even this, and you still want that big aperture of at least f2 or f2.8, Tamron also makes the 35 to 105mm lens, but this is going to be a little costlier. You also gotta account for the aperture not being constant. At 35mm, it's going to be f2, but as soon as you start shifting your zoom focal range, it's gonna start jumping all the way to f2.8 right away. Plus, it's gonna be a little heavier, being at 2.6 pounds, and overall it's gonna cost you $1,699 US. So it all really depends how much zoom range you really want. But who really should buy this lens? I would recommend this to the enthusiasts or the professional photographers or videographers that need that constant f2.8. You're shooting indoor situations, you're probably gonna be doing weddings, or maybe you take care of your church just like I do. Perhaps you don't plan on getting prime lenses or already have prime lenses. So this would be a great choice for you to be able to slap on your camera, set it, and forget it. 24mm isn't a big deal to you, and you really just want to use this mostly for the telephoto range of 105mm, or punch in with super 35mm mode and get 157mm. If there's anything that they could improve with this lens, yeah, they could always make it sharper, or perhaps with their Mark II version, they can make it even lighter and sharper. In the end, this lens is a keeper. It's sharp, has good autofocus, the zoom range is just so versatile that you really don't want to buy any other lens. If you can get over the lack of stabilization for it, this might as well be a keeper for you too. But if you want to see what a cheaper version of this looks like, check out this video right over here.